Welcome to today's webinar, The State of DEIJ in Nonprofits. This is the survey results from Nonprofit HR, and we're hosted by the Nonprofit Alliance and presented by Nonprofit HR. So I'm Abby Graff. I'm the Vice President of Programs and Community Engagement at the Nonprofit Alliance. We also go by TNPA. And I want to take just a quick minute to tell you about TNPA, and then we will jump into our topic for today. So TNPA is a membership association. We work to promote, protect, and strengthen the nonprofit sector. Our membership's made up from two streams. One is nonprofit organizations from across the United States, both big and small. The other part of our membership is the companies and the agencies who provide services to nonprofits to support their mission-based work. Our work at TNPA is really focused on a couple things: legislation and policy, to ensure that we have policies that support the work of the nonprofit sector. That can be everything from tax policy, like charitable deductions or the extension of the universal charitable deduction, can also mean human resource policies, and a lot of technical policies like privacy legislation. And even recently, there's been a whole whirlwind surrounding the new MasterCard rules that regulate recurring donations. So that's not even government policy, but just a company policy that impacts our work and that we've been actively involved in and in conversations with MasterCard. We also do a lot of programming for education and network for nonprofit staff and the leadership. And in fact, next week, we have in New York City a one-day Rising Leaders Summit. And there are actually still a few seats available. If you're interested, you can find that on our website. And we do a lot of other leadership programming, including leadership summits in person, where leaders come together and work together on how to address the pressing issues of our sector. We also have a very popular online year-round Essential Leadership Lab that meets monthly. So if you're not already a member of TNPA, we hope you will consider joining. And you can find more information on our website, of course, tnpa.org. So a few quick logistics. We will send out a follow-up email within the next few days. It will include the slides from the presentation, a recording from today, and also the codes for those of you who are interested in credits for recertification for SHRM or HRCI. We've also turned on live captions for today. So if that is of interest to you, you should see that option in your lower control bar where it says either live transcript or CC, and you can turn that on. And then during the presentation, the chat is open for chatting. Thank you. And if it's not, I'll double confirm that. And sharing ideas and thoughts there. And then for questions directed specifically to our presenters, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for submitting those questions. So this is a very important topic. We're all here and ready to dive into the meat of it. We're excited to have the team from Nonprofit HR here today to walk us through what they've learned in their survey, what they're seeing, and what they're advising in the field. And so Nonprofit HR is a talent management firm that works exclusively with the nonprofit sector, so a great ally to have. Quick introductions: Lisa Brown Alexander, who you see on the screen, is the president and CEO and the founder of Nonprofit HR. Welcome, Lisa. Her work has really shifted the way the sector thinks about talent and culture. And with her team, she's really proven that better talent practices can play an integral role in nonprofit success and impact. And we also have Brian Jackson, a senior consultant, EDIJ at Nonprofit HR. And he provides subject matter expert advice, insight, and strategic direction to clients. And that is just a scratch the surface of what he is able to offer and his skills and support. So suffice it to say, we're going to learn a lot from these presenters today. We look forward to learning from their depth of experience and expertise and overall perspective with these issues. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic and the camera over to the team from Nonprofit HR. Welcome, Lisa and Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Abby mentioned, I'm the president and CEO of Nonprofit HR, and we are delighted to share this information with you today. So many organizations are in varying points of their DEI journey, and we're hopeful that the information we share with you and the benchmark data that we've collected for the sector is helpful in advancing your organization's efforts to be more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive, and more justice-based. And so let's get started. So we thought it would be helpful to provide you with some background context on the survey and who participated in it. And what we find with many of our surveys, not just this survey, but other surveys, is that the participation tends to align with where there are the strongest numbers of nonprofits across the country. And so California, DC, and New York represent regions of the country where nonprofits really represent a large percentage of the workforce. For example, in Washington, DC, nonprofits comprise of some 26% of the employment community in the Washington, DC area. And so California, New York, and DC are where we have a critical mass of participants, but this is a national survey, and we did hear from organizations in other parts of the country. Next slide. In terms of organizational budget size, you'll note that we had 588 participants in this survey, with a critical mass of organizations being relatively small. So those organizations that have budgets of 5 million or less comprised 42% of our participants. We had a smaller number of really large, or what some organizations call mega-sized nonprofits. Those with budgets of over 50 million represented just about 8% of survey participants, and then the rest kind of fell in the middle there. In terms of headcount, just in case you want to benchmark where your organization is vis-a-vis participants, majority of the organization size from a headcount perspective had 75 or fewer employees, with a decent percentage of organizations, 15% having more than 250 employees, and then a larger percentage having between 76 and 250 employees. So good mix of organizational sizes, geography, and budget. Next slide. In terms of areas of focus or mission focus, we saw the most participating organizations come from children, youth, and families, or human and social services, which we often see in our surveys. There's a large number of organizations from this particular segment of the sector that are looking for data and find our surveys helpful. But we also heard from organizations in healthcare, in education, and the association and arts and culture spaces. So a good diverse base of organizations participated in this national survey. Great to see everyone popping on. So what I think is really helpful for you to know is that the sector is making really good progress with the place that DEI or EDIJ or DEIB, depending on where you are, is being placed. And what we're seeing on average is 72% of responding organizations have prioritized DEI or a variation of DEI as part of what they do and part of their organizational strategy work. We also know that an increasing number of organizations, based on this survey having been done now for 3 years, more and more organizations are prioritizing justice. That's something that we just began to ask about of participating organizations. And I'll turn to Brian to really define what we mean by justice. But if you think about kind of the components of this space, there's diversity, which many organizations know. There's inclusion, there's equity, there's belonging, and there's justice. And so we're seeing a greater emphasis by organizations on justice. We also know that increasingly organizations are having a DEI or a DEIJ strategy in place. When we first started the survey 3 years ago, 17% was not the number. And so we are seeing progress. Many organizations have statements, but increasingly organizations are going beyond making a statement to include a strategy which really integrates with who they are as an organization, what it is they're seeking to achieve. And even more encouragingly, we're seeing progress around organizations funding this work, right? So putting a placeholder in the budget to make the work real. Next slide. We heard from organizations that they have featured DEI or J as an organizational core value, which is important because your values are what dictate the behavior that you deem acceptable in your organization. And so having some element of diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging in your values says that it's important that you expect staff to kind of govern their behavior according to those tenets. And so we're glad to see progress in this realm as well. What's even more important from my perspective as a CEO is seeing organizations feature DEI in their strategic plans, which is incredibly valuable, because that means it's really living throughout the organization. It's integrated in what you say you want to do and how you want to do it, and integrating it in strategy as opposed to having it sit outside of strategy is really the optimal place for this work. Many organizations, 45%, are offering training to their staff at some level on topics that are specific to DEI, and 53% of organizations didn't prioritize this work and really saw the impact of not prioritizing this work on their organizations. So recognizing that there are organizations that are far along in the DEI journey, there are organizations that are kind of just beginning and really starting to integrate it into their work. And then there are still organizations who have not made this work a priority. And we appreciate their candor and sharing where they are, and hope that information like this will help them move that work forward. Next slide.
And thank you so much, Lisa. And also, again, thank you all for joining from across the country. We are going to dive a little bit into some of the details of our data. And we first want to highlight, for those organizations that said, yes, we have a formal strategy. Those are essentially strong indicators that you are prioritizing the integration of this work, as well as you are seeing it as a value add for the overall consensus of being the best representation of an organization that you can be. And from our data, we can begin to see that we had those that said yes at 43% as their primary driver of developing a strategy and addressing some of the opportunities in making the environment more equitable, more inclusive, more diverse, all leading towards justice. And the way that I often say justice is diversity, inclusion, and equity are actions, right? We want our organization to be inclusive. We want our organization to be diverse, but justice is the commitment to it. Justice is being able to see it matriculate over time, the benefits as by way of the results of having planted a seed in the action, but being able to see the fruits of it grow into the action. We also see with this particular data point that organizations may have done an assessment of their organization. And by way of doing an evaluation of your organization, you can begin to identify opportunities that could be glaring in some respects, but it can also just be very informative, because you can't know where you're going until you know where you have come from within an organization. And so, and as the primary driver for folks within having a strategy, it is important to address what some of these issues are within the organization to be able to make it more equitable and inclusive and diverse. So you will see here that there are some other reasons why people created strategies for their organization. And they might have said that they wanted to improve the DEIJ within all staff levels, meaning that they want more of a diverse pool of people within the whole organization. One of the other data points is needing to improve internal DEIJ of thought, essentially just planting seeds in the mind of why this is important and why we are focusing on this as an organization. But we also see here too, at 2.3%, the improving of talent retention. Folks want to feel that they belong to something greater than themselves, but they also want to feel too that if I belong, the impact of that is wanting to stay. This item here ties back to the first question that we had earlier in how we are able to prioritize the DEIJ and what does that look like? And for most organizations, having a staff member that is solely responsible for DEIJ or DEI, they're all interchangeable, y'all. So EDIJ, DEI, JEDI, however you want to say it, I'm going to stick with one and I may revert back to the other. So please give me the grace. But basically what we are saying is for an organization to have a sole person committed to this work is also showing the commitment to this work as well. And so with this item, respondents that identified with the having of someone within a particular role for EDIJ, 31% of the organizational respondents said, yes, we do have someone that prioritizes this work. And 68% said that they do not. And 2%, 1.3 or 1.4 actually said that we don't know. And again, the interesting data as this appears is having someone committed to this allows for the optics to be, we are prioritizing this, we are centering this, and we are making this we're making this a lot more important than just saying that we're doing it.
Mhm.
To make the commitment means that you have to also include resources, also include access, and also include the opportunity to see this journey be exactly that, a journey.
That said, I do think it's important to note that many of the same organizations that don't have a dedicated DEI leader also don't have a dedicated HR leader, right? And so we recognize that many organizations are kind of deprived or resource poor when it comes to talent management. Anything really related to the people of an organization is often understaffed, which is why nonprofit HR exists, right? To serve that need. And so I do want to acknowledge that for many organizations, having someone solely dedicated to this work is a luxury. We do recognize that, or at least out of reach. I won't call it a luxury, out of reach based on the resources that they have available.
And thank you so much for that, Lisa. And you also made me think of this as well. Just to be clear, y'all, if you don't have someone in this role, that doesn't make your organization bad, right? That also doesn't mean that you are behind the pale of being able to advance this work, right? This is data. This is just us being able to engage with our constituents and them just being honest with where they are in time and space. So please understand that if you do, amazing. If you don't, that is okay as well, as long as you are putting the EDIJ at the forefront of the why, strides and steps can still be made into advancing this work.
Absolutely.
And so then this next item, respondents were asked to indicate whether or not the staff person that is within this position has the opportunity to appropriately be able to advance this work. And so at 61%, the respondents affirmed by saying yes, that the organization indicated that the person within this role was resourced and they had the autonomy to be able to move this work forward. The reason why this is important is because you just can't have someone in this role without the power, without the leadership, without the resources to be able to advance this work. But then there's also an interesting kind of trend too, where almost 27% said that this was not the case for them. Again, if you have a person in the position that has the ability to really move this work forward, and it's more than just saying, hey, you have our support, you need dollars behind the support. You need the ability to be able to make decisions on a leadership level, to be able to have this be taken seriously, but also to have people truly get behind it. And then about 14% of those that have responded indicated that they don't know. And so this could be an indication of not having the information, not understanding how budgets are or how to allocate some of the funds. And so again, to have someone in this position, to have the resources, that is great. But sometimes not having the resources doesn't necessarily mean that we are talking about financial resources, right? We could be talking about a lot of other items that could help someone believe that they can do this work. Case in point, do you have the full support of your leader, right? When there are issues that happen within the organization, are there thought partnerships going on with a number of brains and minds and positions instead of it all solely falling on one person who doesn't feel that they have the support to be able to move some of this work forward? And so I do see that we have a question in the chat and I want to address it. Oh, Abby, I'm taking your role. Go ahead, Abby, I'm sorry. You're on mute.
You are welcome. If you see it in the chat, in the Q&A, you're welcome to take it right away. But when there's one person when you're talking about one person who's solely responsible, Do you need this person for that to be their only responsibility, or can it be part of their responsibility? How do you all think about that?
So this, I mean, it's a great question, and we can answer this one of two ways. Yes, and, right? Having one sole person in that role with the title of being the DEI practitioner, but also having someone that is doing this role in conjunction with some of the other roles as well can also be a value add. What we have seen with a number of our clients is that there's a coalition of thought partnership that could be one person that has a sole job, but then also someone that is committed to this work as well. But yet and still being able to compensate that person for these additional roles, be able to provide that support for these additional roles. All of these parts of the conversation need to be understood in order for that person to feel that they are valued and that they are a part of the mosaic of your organization to be able to move this work forward. Thank you for that question as well. And I'll pass it right back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Brian. So what we heard was the ultimate accountability for EDIJ or DEI work in an organization most traditionally rests with the CEO, which is a good thing, right? Because we know that the CEO in organizations, vast majority of organizations, is the one who has the ultimate power to decide what gets done and what gets resourced. So it's encouraging. However, we also know that it's a shared responsibility. Advancing the work of being a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization is a shared responsibility. And so we're encouraged to see that 29% of respondents said that this responsibility rests with the leadership team, which is encouraging as well. In some organizations, a smaller number, only 4%, or 4.63%, say that this accountability rests with the chief diversity officer, which can be a challenge because ultimately, if that person has the title but doesn't have the power in their organization, they'll face challenges in moving the work forward. And so while we are encouraged to see that this rests in 4% of organizations, from our perspective, the ultimate is for it to be shared across the organization. In some organizations, 10%, DEI work sits in the human resources or talent management function and rests with the senior person there. And then in a very small number of organizations, it rests with an outside consulting firm or someone who has the expertise but may not necessarily be on staff. In the 8% represented in the other category, we see organizations that are sharing this work through committees, staff-led committees, through a combination of board and staff, through external stakeholders and staff. So there are all kinds of ways that you can create accountability in your organization. Ultimately, someone needs to own it though. Someone needs to call it and make sure that you stay on track with the goals that you set as an organization. You'll note at the bottom, although we apologize for the fuzziness of the image on the screen, when you get the slides, they will be super clear. But in 2021, when we asked this question, 41% of respondents said that the ultimate accountability for DEI sat with the leadership team. And so we're seeing more of this being pushed to the CEO, which is good. It's a good thing. As a CEO, I can speak to that because ultimately it's people who are in the executive director or CEO role who can make sure that things happen, right? So it's a good thing. All right, let's keep going. Can you advance that slide for me, Brian?
There we are.
There we go. Great. We asked the question of respondents about whether or not their organization formed a work team or a task force, which is a common way that organizations advance their DEI efforts when there is not a dedicated resource or when the organization perhaps is still trying to influence leaders to take the work seriously. So it can be a bottoms-up approach or a top-down approach. And in 70% of respondents, we see that the organization forms a work team or a task force whose responsibility it is to make sure that this work happens. Now, it's not an either-or proposition, as Brian aptly said. In many instances, it's yes and. So you can both have a CEO or an ED who's ultimately accountable and still create and work with the task force who is bringing life to the efforts and making sure that they happen, and being the eyes and ears on the ground for leaders to make sure that they know what's really going on and what folks are concerned about. I see you popped back up, Abby.
Yeah, Lisa, there's an interesting question around if you have one sole person, or perhaps this would apply even if you were with a whole team, does it make it hard for that person to continue their own journey? Is their sole focus really supporting the journeys of other people? How does that balance out with their own learning?
That's a really good question. I think it really just depends on the individual who's sitting in the seat. Everyone's in a different place. And so there are some people who are at the beginning, some people are at the end. I don't know that it makes it more difficult. It just depends on the receptivity of the person who's sitting in the seat, if they want to learn from both others' experiences and their own. And if they do, then it doesn't become difficult. But Brian, you might have a different take on that question.
No, I was just going to add to that as well. It also depends on what the North Star is. Like, you can't have someone with dual responsibilities looking through HR documents to see if pay is equitable. Like, you can't have someone that is responsible for their other job looking into demographics and information that they might not be privy to, or might not have access to. It's always good to start off small. And to start off small is to first figure out, what is it that we want to start to establish within our organization? Do we want to start off with affinity groups? Who else can I find within the organization that can also be an advocate? Again, we say one sole person in the role, but this is truly a team effort, right? And so the true essence of having one person in this role is for them to be able to divide and conquer. And the division is being able to say, if we are going to do affinity groups, how can we do that? If we are going to go ahead and have EDIJ library within our organization, how can we go ahead and do those things? And so it's important to first recognize that there are certain things that are within the wheelhouse of an individual to be able to champion within an organization. But you also have to make sure that that person is trained, that that person has support, and that that person has the capacity to be able to scale back, because a lot of this work for people is hard, it's traumatizing, right? And how someone at the beginning of their journey deals with this versus someone that has been living this journey all of their life, being asked to do more, we have to find that balance, right? We have to find that balance. But a team, a coalition, again, you guys are a mosaic. And so there are a number of people within the organization that can champion this, that could also be in lockstep and key with you in being able to move all of this forward as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a team effort.
Yeah.
The diversity of the staff reflects the communities that we serve. This is a difficult one because it really depends on where you are and what you define as diverse in your organization, right? But what we do know is that 34% of organizations say yes. Last year, that response was 53% that said the diversity of my staff reflects the communities where we serve. This year, we had 16, almost 17% saying no. Diversity is one element of this bigger wheel, right? And so you can have diversity in a number of ways. It's not just race, gender, or sexual identity. It can come in a number of different ways. And so depending on how you look at the issue, you may have answered this question one way or the other. So it's encouraging to see that 34% believe that the diversity of their staff reflects the communities where they serve. In many instances, that's important to stakeholders in the community to see themselves reflected in the staff. But we know that that's it's a progression, right? As organizations move forward in advance, and then more than half, or just under half rather, said that it's somewhat. So maybe in some aspects they have representation, but in others not. So for example, you could have an organization that is located in a community where there's a high percentage of Latino people, but you may have a higher representation of African Americans on your staff. And so you might answer this question as somewhat in that case, right? Because while you may have people of color, the people of color mix may be different than, or the composition of that group may be different than the community where you serve. So it is a complex question, but one that increasingly matters to stakeholders. stakeholders want to see themselves reflected in the organizations that are serving in their community. It helps from a cultural competency perspective in program design and program and service delivery. And so, this is not a question that should be taken lightly, but one that ultimately, we encourage organizations to seek out efforts to be as diverse as they can be. I think I'm passing this one back to you, Brian, or is this me?
This is still you as well.
Still me. Okay, great. Okay,
yes.
Great. So we asked organizations about metrics, right? So what matters gets measured, and we asked organizations if they had implemented any of the following DEI metrics as part of their journey. What we learned is that retention metrics are being collected by organizations based on women and underrepresented groups. So they're tracking who stays and who goes based on their demographic representation. Fewer organizations are doing this as it relates to pay and rewards-based systems. The greatest collection of data that we see is in the interview and hiring process. Organizations are tracking who they're interviewing and hiring as a way of measuring their progress in this space, followed by recruitment pool demographics. Now that can be harder in this day and age because we're not always seeing a candidate, and we can look at people and make assumptions about how they identify, or based on what we think we've heard them say. And so this is a tricky one, but what we do know is that if you want to tangibly measure your progress, either in recruitment, retention, or development, it is helpful to track some of this information and understand, at least at a baseline, the composition of your workforce, the composition of your leadership team from a diverse perspective or a representation perspective, and to track how your organization is performing, particularly on the recruitment side. That's where a lot of organizations start. So start there, right? Just to track who are you hiring and who are you not hiring, and does it represent a particular trend that either supports or hinders your diversity efforts? We do know that 50% of organizations are tracking metrics around race, gender, and diverse ability demographics. And so that's probably the most popular thing. And then 26% of organizations have not implemented any metrics around this work. Understandable, it can be challenging, particularly if you don't have a human resources information system or some sort of database or repository where you can collect this information. If you're doing it on a spreadsheet in Excel, it can be a little more challenging to keep it up to date. And so this is really just intended to help you understand what other organizations are doing and where you may have opportunities to track metrics and demonstrate progress. Next slide. The data gathered from metrics is oftentimes shared in organizations. So what we've learned is that those organizations that are tracking data are sharing it with their staff. More than half of the organizations that are collecting are saying, listen, we're not going to just collect it, but we're going to let you know where we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. And we really applaud those organizations that are both tracking and reporting on metrics. It helps to build a sense of accountability, to create a sense of transparency about efforts being made in this space. Many organizations are also sharing this information just with senior management versus the whole staff. And then others are sharing it with the board. So increasingly, we are seeing grantors request this information. So some 20% of you are reporting your demographic and DEI metrics with your grantors and funders. And then also to the community, as I mentioned before, communities are increasingly requiring this of organizations that are placing themselves in their neighborhoods and want to know what organizations are doing, how they're progressing, and how things are changing. Next slide.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lisa. And so now we are now going to talk about training and those organizations that have provided different types of trainings for different types of stakeholders. And so this data has been done in previous years. And so getting stakeholder foundational training so that they can understand the foundations of DEI and what that means for the organization, how we can all center justice, and how it all shows up within an organization is important. And so as we look at the data, the highest one that we see is 79% of trainings happening for staff. We're also seeing that leadership within organizations have received a substantial amount of training as well. And the interesting thing is looking at what the trends are saying as far as the board and external stakeholders. This is an opportunity now to really start thinking about how we can get the board more involved in some of the foundational work of understanding why DEI is important, but also how it impacts the organization as well. We often tend to think that boards are separate of the staff, but a board is also connected to the staff, right? What do we often say? Those most closest to the issue have a lot of solutions. Those most furthest from the issue have the ability to impact systems, right? And so how do we get the board involved? But a lot of external stakeholders are now asking organizations, hey, what are y'all doing, right? Like, we want to know. The external stakeholders can be volunteers, right? It can also be those that are donating money to your nonprofit. And so the external stakeholders, here's a pathway to really invite them in to the growth as well. So they not only can see the work that is being done within the organization and how it's impacting the staff, the leadership, and the board, but you also have an advocate and a champion as well. We cannot continue to think that the work that we do within our organizations is siloed. No, a lot of what we do within nonprofits is plant the seed, we foster that seed, and the work continues to happen as we are impacting communities. Stakeholders are a part of that community. And so this is a good opportunity for us to start thinking about how to increase our external stakeholders and board engagement as it relates to DEI and EDIJ training. Also, we asked the question around what type of trainings. If you are providing trainings, what type of trainings are you providing? This is important because it allows for you to identify sort of, again, that North Star. Where can we start? What should we focus on? So 65% of our respondents that received training received most of their training in the general DEI sense. And that is foundational understanding of what DEI is, what it looks like, how it manifests, so on and so forth. 60% said that they focus specifically on implicit bias trainings. And often we know that implicit bias does creep within our organizations, and implicit bias can impact how we interview, how we make decisions. And so we want to make sure that we are looking at ways that we can mitigate our bias as it relates to retaining talent, finding talent, and making sure that the talent feels that they are being championed. So knowing and understanding is the start. And then identifying what pathways do we need to interrupt. Some of the other trainings that some of our respondents noted offering to their staff lean more towards race-centered trainings, gender-specific trainings, LGBTQIA+ trainings, age-centered trainings. And this is really important now, given that we have all been classified by our age, whether we are millennials, Gen X, boomers. But this is important, right? Because just by noting someone's title, right? If they are a Gen Zer, some people can make an assumption about that, right? And so what we want to make sure that we do is provide the trainings to help sort of make that bridge instead of further creating gaps. And so any one of these trainings is beneficial to your organization. Any one of these would be substantial into helping people feel a part of a community. But as you can see, again, a very large percentage of the training centered around general DEI trainings and that of implicit bias.
I just want to highlight there, Brian, one of the reasons I think that that's the case is because many organizations are in fact at the beginning of their journey. A lot of organizations really got focused on this work, quite frankly, after the murder of George Floyd. And there was a new awareness, an awakening by leaders in organizations that we need to do something. And so it's now 2023. George Floyd was murdered in May of 2020. And so, you know, it's only been 3 years. If your organization has only done general DEI training or only implicit bias training, don't feel bad. We want to make sure that you understand that, your organization and 50,000 others across the country, probably more than that, 50 million organizations across the country are at the beginning as well. And so foundational training helps raising awareness, helps, it shifts the dialogue in organizations and is a great place to start. So I just wanted to emphasize that's why we're seeing so many organizations doing baseline training, because they're really helping people kind of get started. It's hard to kind of jump straight into allyship and privilege and to talk about gender specific training when you haven't established a baseline of learning in your organization.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa. And so when we asked respondents to identify all the ways that diversity challenges apply to their organization's talent management function, 74% of respondents indicated that attracting a diverse pool of candidates is probably at the top of their list. Okay, this is something that we hear within our sector quite often. And when we look at other ways that it might show up, when we think about retaining gender segments and underrepresented populations on staff, or retaining a diverse staff in general, about 40% indicated that this is an area of concern or consideration. About 39% indicated that implementing engagement practices for a diverse staff was a way that impacts talent management. So over half indicated that creating and or maintaining a culture of inclusiveness was at the top of mind and interest for many organizations. And then having or maintaining a diverse staff across the organizational hierarchy, or thinking back to the promotional practices to advancement, are also at the top of mind too for organizations. Internally, about 61% indicated that there are areas that often show up. So having an accountability measure for staff, such as performance management metrics, and about 45 to 46% indicate that that's where it is most often showing up. And so as we look at this data here, we can begin to see that the support of DEI as it relates to talent management can really hit the work cycle of an employee within your organization, from onboarding all the way through the maintaining of that candidate, but also the extension of being able to attract candidates for your organization as well. And so just under 3% indicated that they do not have an EDIJ challenge when it comes to talent management. That's a high number, even though it's 3, right? It's still a high number. And again, wherever you are on this journey, that is okay, right? Just because you don't necessarily have a challenge doesn't mean that that would be the case tomorrow. A lot of us didn't have any challenges and then COVID hit. So then how do we reformulate our systems thinking? How do we reformulate being communicative? How do we reformulate hearing people where they are? And so again, you never really arrive when you are on this journey, you just recharge. And so this is what we are seeing across the board with our organizations as well. On this slide, we are looking at whether or not the organizations have changed their HR or talent management process within a year, and 79% indicated that diversity has actually been impacted. 71% indicated that they are working on addressing equity. 35% of the organizations polled noted that inclusion has been impacted. So as we look at this data, we can say that diversity is probably the easiest one of these to impact. We can hire, recruit more, we can have fairs, job fairs at different locations. However, equity is looking more deeply into these systems and how they impact the people, i.e. compensation trends, and why are people leaving, right? Your exit interview is just as important as your onboarding interview, right? Because that person has institutional knowledge. How are we able to identify what we are doing that's well and what we aren't doing that's not well, so we don't continue these cycles? When we get into inclusion and belonging, we see that 35 and 49% speak to these two trends. These are the harder ones to impact. And I may be someone that adds diversity to the staff, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I feel included, right? That also doesn't necessarily mean that I feel like I belong. All of us on this call has felt that they have not belonged in some context in their life, trust me. but we also know what that feeling is like when we do feel that we belong. And so just because you change the shape of your organization, it doesn't necessarily mean that you change the feeling of the organization. So this is a great way to be able to tap into what are people saying about what it feels like to work here? That is a question that I often tell executives and leaders. Have you ever asked the question to your staff, like, what does it feel like to work here? This is a good way to get a sense of inclusion. This is also a good way to really get a sense of belonging. And as you can see here, all of these are connected, right? All of these are connected. And so we just want to make sure that if we are being an invitive place to diverse candidates, we want to make sure that we are creating a space where they feel included and they also feel that they belong. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Brian. When it comes to practices and policies that organizations have changed, most organizations are starting at and seeing the greatest amount of progress in their hiring and interviewing practices. Kind of aligns with what we saw just a moment ago around recruitment, and organizations having made progress to attract more diverse talents to their organizations. So, but we are also seeing that organizations are looking at their compensation as probably the most popular thing to examine and evaluate through the lens of DEI. One, is there just disparate impact on certain classes of staff within your organization? Are all the younger people being paid below market and all the older folks, people over 50, being paid above market? Are your male staff, kind of progressing through the organization in a way that's different than the women or people who identify as women? So practice and policies around compensation and benefits is where we're seeing most organizations make policy change, but we're also seeing them make change as it relates to engagement and retention, trying to understand if there's certain segments of their workforce that they're having greater success engaging and retaining than others. For example, you might be a diverse organization from a race perspective, but your turnover rate among staff of color may be higher than white staff. And that may be for a myriad of reasons, not the least of which may be an issue of not having a sense of belonging. So while you may be diverse, speaking to what Brian just spoke to, if staff do not feel included and like they belong and they can participate equitably in decision-making and kind of contributing to your organization, that could impact the extent to which they're engaged and stay with your organization. So these are just some of the policies that we're seeing organizations change and adjust as they make efforts to be more inclusive and diverse and equitable. Next slide. Ongoing racial justice and equality challenges that are impacting organizations. Where we're seeing the biggest impact is those organizations that have made adjustments to prioritize or reprioritize DEI objectives. So racial justice is kind of an element of DEI that really has come to the forefront following the murder of George Floyd. It wasn't just about being a diverse organization, but specifically addressing race-based concerns within your organization, which we know for many is difficult, painful, challenging, scary. And so to the extent that organizations are making progress with ongoing racial justice and equity challenges or equality challenges within their organization, it's understandable because this is some of the hardest work. As I often say when I talk about this conversation, is America did not become or get where it was overnight. And it will take, unfortunately, I think many years, maybe even generations before we see a change in systems and practices and policy. Again, employee stakeholder groups leading DEI efforts due to racial justice and equity, equality events. We're really seeing a more of a bottoms-up approach. So not necessarily seeing, a top-down approach. We're seeing that it's leadership, senior leadership staff are the ones that are leading efforts in organizations, and that's a good thing because senior leadership often have the power, access to resources, connections and the like to make things happen. So we're seeing the greatest amount of effort in leading this work happen at the senior management team, but we're also seeing it among mid-level staff and even on the frontline staff. In many organizations, the voice of the people is coming from the youngest contingent of staff, and they may not be the largest segment of your staff, but they are oftentimes the most vocal. So we're encouraged by that as well. Excuse me, I'm sounding like my voice is disappearing there. All right.
All right. And so now, tips for taking action. We often get, so what can we be doing, right? And so we are going to move into some of what we are calling our top 10 recommendations to support your organization as you begin to do this work, or as you continue to do this work. So we're going to talk about what this looks like as an action-oriented, but also making sure that we look at what not to do as we are starting to take some of these actions. So for some of us that remember the David Letterman show, the top 10 list. So we're going to start with 10 do's and don'ts. And so to do EDIJ or DEI within your organization, you want to make sure you ground your organization in a shared meaning around what DEI is, right? There's a lot of us that don't fully understand what this all means. Some of us just think that it's about race, but it could also be about gender. It can also be about family styles. It can also be about parenting. It can also be about body size. Like, we have to begin to see that we are, again, a mosaic of amazing and awesomeness. But a lot of times we are consolidating what makes us unique to have people look at us to think that they know who we are. And so we have to begin to understand that this shared understanding is based upon your organization in time and space, your staff in time and space. And what we don't want to do is assume that everyone understands what DEI is, because we are all starting in the same place. Some people are just trying to figure out what the D in DEI stands for, and that is okay. And some of us are tired. We have been waiting for this all of our lives. And you know what? We heard this before with the last ED. What you gonna do? So what we want to make sure that we do is we ground everyone in the shared understanding that the best step to take in this work is the first step. Please take it with us. And then we can start to somewhat roll out what this robust plan then will look like as this continues. Another thing to do is gain clarity about why you want to engage in DEI work and how it connects to your overall mission. What is your North Star? What is your why? Is it retention? Is it to make yourself the best representation of an organization that you can be? First, identify the why. What we don't want to do is engage in sporadic DEI work because it is on trend or it is a reaction to a prominent event. What we have here is something that is transformative and something that is performative, okay? Staff will begin to feel that this is real, right? When there's clarity around it, when there are metrics around it, when there are initiatives around it, when they see it in the strategic plan. But if you're doing it at the expense of an event that took place in the news or in the world, it then has a tendency to not really feel authentic, okay? And so identify the why, and then start to make connections to the why by way of the actions that you are doing.
Yeah, I strongly advise organizations against being reactive. Now, that said, a lot of organizations got on their journey after the murder of George Floyd in reaction to what they saw. But I think it's critically important that you remain authentic and honest about where you are as an organization, because if you don't, your staff will out you, right? So if you make kind of declarative statements online about the type of organization that you are versus the type of organization that you're aspiring to be, and those two things are not connected, someone will say something. This is the age that we live in. And so, you know, don't just react to trends and wax eloquent online about what your organization is, if in fact it isn't. Be honest, be transparent, recognizing that your why is really, that North Star is everything, making sure you understand that. Yeah.
And you just made me think of something as well, Lisa. Just be authentic, right? Like, if you haven't started and it was based in fear or not knowing,
Mhm.
that too is an invitation in versus just sporadically having moments of trying and then not having the follow through, right? Because all of this DEI work that we're talking about is related to feel. And as we know with feeling and people, having a genuine delivery is will allow for people to see the authenticity versus saying, you know what, this is just another check the box. Another do is prominently sharing your commitment to DEI across your virtual footprint. Listen, staff and those that may be interested candidates into your organization, we have more access into seeing if you are walking the walk and you are talking the talk. We can engage with LinkedIn, we can engage with Glassdoor. There are other mechanisms for us looking at your Twitter and your Facebook page to see where this information lives within the context of your organization. When I go to your website, do you have a DEI statement that is front facing? Because if I have to click 10 times to find it, then I am pretty sure that that may not be frontward facing. Allow your DEI, don't allow for your DEI commitment to be buried in on your website. But this is also a way for us to say, do not allow for the DEI to be the soup of the day, right? An example that I often give executives is if I look on your Facebook page or your Instagram page, and the only time I see people of color is for Black History Month, but I keep scrolling and I don't see any other people of color, then that's an indication to me that, you know what, perhaps this might not, I don't know. It's just it's a feel. And so what I would like for us to be mindful of is people want to be able to feel that your mission aligns with their moral compass. And they also want to feel too that they will be able to come in their full superpower and be embraced and be welcomed and be celebrated and be championed. And the best way to do that is to prominently share that the staff that you have, regardless of what makes them different, it makes them amazing as well.
Mhm.
To do, position DEI as a long-term journey that is connected to the strategy and mission. And also don't expect DEI outcomes immediately, okay? This is a journey, right? For a lot of us that are on the East Coast, I saw that in the chat, we just can't get to California in 10 seconds. Like it just doesn't happen by that way. It's a journey, it's a process. So as Lisa said early on, a lot of these systems that we have seen or that we are seeing have been in creation for years, decades, right? And so to somewhat yeah, there we go, yes. So what we are talking about is deconstructing some of these systems in the context of what we have the capability of deconstructing. And so position this a part of the long-term journey, putting it within a strategic plan. What you often say is if you see it and it's in black and white, that means I'm committed to it, right? So if it's in your strategic plan, you can't come back 5 years from now and saying, you know what, Lisa, now we decided not to do that. Like that is not going to allow for people to feel that this is a true commitment. And also understand too, the long-term goals that you want to achieve, celebrate the short-term goals that aren't often celebrated, right? If you get people to start coming to committee meetings, if you get people to start talking about DEI openly, if you develop affinity groups within your organization, these are things that you need to out and celebrate, because this is also a way to see that these aren't just immediate fixes, but these are a part of the long-term journey of learning for the whole staff.
Mhm.
Do gather demographic data and trends to inform strategy and actions. It is very difficult to make a general framework on what you want to do as an organization if you're not truly recognizing how the specifics of your organization will be impacted by the general. So for example, if you are seeing that compensation isn't the same across positions, right? If women are increasingly receiving less compensation than some of their counterparts, gather that data from HR and begin to look at trends. Associate the why with race, with age, with credentials. Start to look at this data for it can help inform strategies, but it can also be the North Star. The other thing is to not hide your data, okay? we work with a number of organizations, and this can be tough for organizations, but it can also be tough for EDs or CEOs. But it's also a good key into opening up some doors. Okay. And to work with someone that is saying to you, hey, this doesn't make your organization bad. This doesn't make you a bad person. You still have people committed to your mission and they are doing amazing work. But just imagine what this would feel like if folks were coming in and they were able to be their authentic self, right? That's not going to stop the work. It is only going to enhance the work. So don't hide or suppress that data, because as Lisa said earlier as well, people know. People do know. There were a number of organizations after George Floyd's murder that were putting up Instagram posts, and people within them organizations like, nah, that ain't the real. That's not it.
And within minutes, not years later, within minutes.
Within seconds.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So please recognize that though this data may be difficult, it is also a good pathway into that long-term journey, into highlighting what are low-hanging fruit wins that we can do that are transformative, and what's the long-term journey into making this transformative as well. Do involve diverse individuals, identities, and a variety of different vantage points and levels and roles within your organization as you develop your strategy. The reason why this is important is because, again, as I said earlier, folks that are most closest to the issue most often have the solution. Those that are in C-suites have the ability to impact strategy. And so having a diverse group of stakeholders will provide you with a diverse perspective into the how, the why, the who, and the what. What you think is most beneficial might not be what the people closest to the issue feel are most beneficial. But having someone at the table, and again, it is important to recognize it is more important than just putting people at the table. Do they have a voice?
Right.
And will that voice be heard? Right? Because the big trend was we got to get everybody at the table. But people got to the table and they didn't feel that they belonged. They didn't feel that it was inclusive. And so does that person have the microphone to be able to speak? And is what they're speaking landing with people that have the ability to impact change? And don't enlist just a small group of the top within designing your strategy, because those that are not at the top will begin to say, you guys aren't being transparent. This isn't inclusive. Here we go again. So there's a reason why we say inclusivity. There's a reason why we say equity. And there's a reason why we say diversity. When all of these things are done, that is when we get into the commitment, which is justice.
Mm-hmm.
Here you go, Linda, Lisa.
So definitely hold senior leaders and people managers accountable to DEI and set them up for success, right? So there are two pieces to that. If you were to have a formal performance management process in your organization where you're measuring performance against some specific demonstrable behaviors and actions, then you can really build DEI practices into your organization. The extent to which your senior managers and hiring managers, people managers are promoting, hiring different staff, the extent to which your leaders are creating inclusive, engaging workplaces, fostering a sense of belonging. And you shouldn't rely on them to tell you that, right? The people to talk to are those who are receiving the behavior of your people managers. So to the extent that you can create some sort of survey instrument, anonymous survey, allow your organization to collect information and then hold leaders accountable if this work is important. But don't place the sole responsibility of DEI on HR or the DEI function if you're so privileged to have that function in your organization. That function really has limited power to exact and create change. It is a collective effort. And it's shared not just by HR and DEI, but also by people who are leading people every day and creating the culture, right? Leaders create culture in organizations. And to the extent that they are creating cultures that are inclusive and equitable, that's fantastic and should be rewarded. And then to the extent that they're driving people out based on their difference, then that should be addressed as well. We're almost down. We're getting down through this list of 10. Spend time in discovery and assessment to understand your organization's current state of DEI. We probably should have started with that one because that's something that is so important. When I was practicing HR on a daily basis, working with organizations, 9 times out of 10, the definition or the understanding of the organization's culture by the leader was different than what actually was. And so helping your organization really understand where you are from an assessment and discovery perspective is so important. Don't go straight into programs, but spend some time in conversation, evaluating, assessing, understanding your current DEI climate in your organization, because that then informs what's going to have the most meaning and the most impact, right? Understand where the problems are, understand what's working, and celebrate that as a way of advancing the work and creating a level of trust that may be necessary to then do harder work later on. But don't create a strategy or take on large-scale DEI actions, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars or even thousands of dollars in training and putting certain people in your advertising if you don't understand the current state. Sometimes that requires getting the perspective of an outside organization, a professional who knows this work and has done it before. Other times you can do that assessment within your organization with someone who's really good at listening and not making assumptions and taking information, synthesizing it, and then coming back and saying, this is what we heard, and here are some things that can be done about it. So that's a really important step to assess, understand, discover, sit in it for a second, listen to those conversations from various stakeholders in your organization. Don't forget the quiet people. They represent an important segment of your workforce, people who are quiet, are oftentimes underrepresented in your organization because they're not kind of making hay, right? They're not kicking up a storm and making a lot of noise, but they have things to say. And so to the extent you can be as inclusive as possible in that discovery effort, you're going to get better results that you can then implement later on.
Absolutely.
Having a written strategy and a plan to get into action is something that we recommend, even if that plan is very rudimentary. You may have 3 or 4 goals on it for a course of a calendar year or a program year. Let that plan be codified in a way that you can go back to it, refer to it, measure your progress, share it with those who have a need or an interest in knowing, including your external stakeholders on board. Even your donors. Sharing that written strategy conveys to everyone that you're taking it seriously and that it matters. But DEI statements in and of themselves, while we're glad to see more and more organizations having statements, statements alone are not enough. Even a plan is not enough without action, right? And so keep it simple, set some kind of attainable goals, maybe 1 or 2 stretch goals, but go for the things where you can realize results and success and build on that success to build trust. One of the things we haven't talked about is the element of trust that weighs in when organizations are trying to advance this work. Trust and suspicion have a real power in organizations and can undermine DEI efforts. And so to the extent that you put it in writing, that you share it, people can digest it and see what you're intending to do, and that your actions align with your plan, that helps to build trust and confidence. And last but not least, engage people from all identities. And we mentioned this before, to solve, not just to help you develop a strategy, but to solve issues, to address the issues within your organization, all identities. Don't just tap the shoulders of the people of color in your organization to solve problems around race. Talk to the white folks too, because they're going to have perspective and experiences that are going to be critical to moving this work forward. Many people of color, as many of you I'm sure have heard before, are tired, they're exhausted, and carry a lot of weight on their shoulders for dealing with racism and issues around race in everyday life. The simplest of actions sometimes can be misconstrued, and that can be exhausting. And so if you reach out to your staff of color to help you move this work forward and they say no, then honor and respect that and give them the space to maybe support from the sidelines, but not to carry the water. But not just people of color, but your younger staff, your older staff. Don't forget the older staff. Staff who identify across various generations, staff who identify as straight or gay or bi, or so get it all. Really engage everyone. That will give you a holistic perspective on your climate, what needs to be done, what can be done to solve issues and concerns, and it will help to build buy-in and support and trust in efforts being made in the future.
Perfect.
We've taken a lot of time, but we do have 15 minutes left to answer any questions that might be burning for you. Brian and my contact information is on screen, so feel free to grab a screenshot of that. Of course, we'll send our slides out to Abby and her team for distribution to you. But what questions do you have? We're pretty good on our feet. We've both been doing this for a while, and we're happy to take any questions that you have in this moment.
Great. First, I wanted it's come up in the chat and in the questions. We will share a recording of the presentation and the slide deck, so you'll get to take a look at that. And one question that I saw coming up, we're kind of putting a couple together here. And well, you guys are out all the time working on DEI and different HR issues. So what does success look like? And my thought is like, I picture you guys coming back from somebody's office and just being like, wow, those guys are amazing. So what does that look like? What are they doing that get you guys excited, really confident that they're moving in the right direction?
So yeah, it's a variety of things, right? First, we have to recognize that no two organizations are alike. And for someone within a leadership position to start to say, I now get it. I now get it. That's huge, right? We often think that it is developing a strategy and implementing that strategy. That is big as well, but we're talking about meeting people where they are. I've gone into rooms where folks have hit hard and like, I don't see what the importance of this is. And what I often say is, hey, you have kids? They're like, yeah, I do. And I said, you know, if you're a male, how much time did you get off for your kid when they were born? I didn't get any time. I'm like, hey man, that's DEI. Wouldn't you have liked to have had 6 weeks, 3 weeks, anytime, right? Like you were a parent, you weren't born as CEO, you were born a person that has a family. So it's helping people to somewhat understand the importance. Another success metric that we often see it revolves around people's excitement to get started, right? You know, we're talking about the gamut of people where they are, demographics and however they identify, but we see people getting really excited. But then also, lastly, I'll say the follow through, right? And what that looks like. You know, I've talked to organizations about how do you celebrate your staff? You know, like, well, we really don't. And I said, well, do you know what candy bars your staff likes to eat or what coffees they like? I said, small things can go a very long way in helping your staff feel that they are being acknowledged. And I come from an education background, an elementary education background. So the importance of being able to tap into how do we champion children also extends itself into sharing information about how to champion adults, right? And so again, these are I don't want to say basic, but these are easy wins. There are more strategic wins that we see over the course of some time. And so we could essentially have a whole nother hour to talk about, you know, what this looks like within organizations. But I would ultimately say people's excitement around the work, people starting to understand the importance of the work, and people starting to feel that I can be a part of the change that I want to see in my organization because I believe that what people bring is just as valuable than our bottom line within our organization. Yes, Rebecca, I understand that. I understand that, but it is also important to recognize again where people are. I mean, I would love to be able to come in and really try to drive initiatives in the way that as a Black male living in America, I'm a big Black male in America that thinks about my life on a day-to-day basis. I would love to be able to go into organizations and know that I'm going into an organization that I may not walk out feeling as strong as I did coming in, because I was traumatized by something that was said by an executive that does not see my humanity. But we also have to be able to start to tap into the start. I would love to come in at 100 miles an hour. As I know a lot of us are DEI practitioners. And again, I apologize for using the candy bar analogy, but it is important to recognize where people are. It is also important to recognize that where you are is different from where someone else is. And trying to find that balance as a consultant is a day-to-day challenge that we have to endure, especially knowing that when I go in, I may hear something that may disrupt my equilibrium. That has happened, but I still have to show up the next day and try to push the work forward as a consultant. So.
Yeah, compensation is definitely an important element of equity and leveling the playing field, but can be very challenging for organizations when they're resource constrained, right? And so we know that many people are underpaid or not paid at market with the spaces, the physical spaces where they are located. So I would agree that compensation is a big part of it. But even if you can't change what people are being paid, you can change the environment in which they are working, which causes them and will enable them to make different decisions about their employer relationships. So I would say culture supersedes pay, because if people feel a sense of belonging, if they feel they are being treated equitably, if they feel that they can be represented and they can have a seat at the table and have a voice at the table, they will be less likely to leave than an organization that compensates well, but is not inclusive and is not equitable and is not just. Yeah.
I realized I was on mute there. Sorry about that. Thinking about if we're the one in the organization who is very excited, do you have tips for the insiders on helping other people and help build that excitement, or a minimum buy-in, if not excitement?
Help people understand not to be fearful. I think one of the biggest hindrances to advancing inclusion and equity and diversity in organizations is fear. Fear to talk about race, fear to talk about gender, fear to talk about difference, fear of talking about inequity, that maybe you get more than I do. And that's a difficult conversation to have. And it's rooted in systems and practices that transcend individual organizations. And it's scary to talk about.
Yeah.
It's scary to admit that maybe you have biases of your own. That when you see someone who is LGBTQ or identifies that way, that you have a less than positive reaction, and you don't want people to know that. And so you might be quiet, and so it's fear that I think keeps a lot of people out of conversation, and fearful of what might happen to whatever space that they occupy as a result of giving more space to others. This is not a pie. So if I give you a slice, Abby, it doesn't mean I won't get a slice to eat too, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of it is fear that I think holds people back. I would say that's probably one of the greatest hindrances, but I know Brian has more insights than I do. He does this work every day.
No, I think you hit it spot on, right? I really do think that you hit it spot on. I mean, this is a forever evolving mechanism. And at the end of the day, it's really being able to see the progress over time by way of commitment, but also celebrating the wins. I think a lot of times within organizations, we look at the outcome. We don't look at the process. And we are process-oriented people. And so along this journey, that process is key, as I said, to recharge people and to really keep them going. This stuff is hard, y'all. I don't want to sit here and make it seem as though this is a cakewalk.
Yeah.
This stuff is really, really hard. And when you're talking about difficulty and you embed feeling and pain and trauma and unseen and all of these different things, all of that plays into developing a strategy that can just get the conversation started, but then gracefully pull back to see the organization maintaining these conversations on their own.
And this kind of leads into Amy's asking a question in the chat that's interesting. one of the things she's finding challenging about the work is confronting that I'll read this. One of the challenging things about this work is that we are confronting very, very deeply embedded systems.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes people come to work with a sense of hopelessness. How can we acknowledge this, but also try to get folks to have some hope that things, at least at one place in their life, can change? Do you have any tips?
So, I mean, I would say your first step is data is key. You know, the hopelessness can rest into why people are feeling hopeless, and the evidence in being able to say, if we are consistently losing people of color, right? If we are not creating a space for people who identify as trans to feel safe in this workspace, then we have the data to be able to start to unpack. It's key because there are certain groups of people within our organization that need data, and data is essential. But then the other piece too, and this is just me personally, I know that the work that I do within organizations can have impact, but I am also thinking about how the work that I am doing for these organizations are going to impact my kids, right? Like I go into these spaces and my hope is that if I can allow for the staff and the executives and the board and the stakeholders to see this as important and start to really move forward into maintaining this work, when my kids graduate from college, the buy-in to it is not going to be as hard, and then my kids can show up being as brilliant as they are in an environment to be celebrated. And so it's A, being able to look at it as a visionary. It's B, believing that how we are feeling can impact our engagement. And so how can you make us feel that our engagement is going to be safe? And how can we be brave in a space that will allow for us to not be harmed and not addressing what the true issue is within this organization?
Thank you. One more question in here from Cynthia. And Cynthia, I'm going to try and get it right, but I'm going to give you permission to come on and talk if you want to clarify. But what advice do you have for evaluating kind of the demographic data in an organization that's small, maybe less than 20? Sometimes those differences can be written off as one-off differences or one-off incidents. So I think the question is really, how do you do this in a really small group?
Yeah, that's when it matters the most, right? So nobody's a one-off in an organization of 5. Everyone, you know, that's 20% of the workforce is represented in one person. And so just changing the narrative about, you know, the value of perspective and insight and one-offness, and recognizing that everyone has a voice, and it's important for those voices to be heard to get at an issue. And it matters even more in a small organization. You can't hide behind, you know, a group when there are only 5 of you and you're looking around a round table in the conference room. That's the whole organization, right? There's nowhere to hide. And so, you know, just giving value and calling out the value of every single person in an organization.
Absolutely.
Particularly when they're small, is critical.
Absolutely.
And the ED can do that, the CEO can do that, to say, listen, I'm the CEO, but I'm 20%, you're 20%. In this conversation, everybody's equal.
100%. Wow. Yeah.
It's so important, even particularly in smaller organizations.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Brian. Did you want to add?
No. I was going to say there's nothing I need to add. I mean, Lisa just hit it out of the park, spot on. I would love to work with organizations that got 20 people, 5 people. That would be amazing.
You wear a lot of different hats when you're in those organizations.
Yeah.
I can speak for that, but it is true. You can't deny anybody's humanity when there's just 5 of you sitting around the table looking at each other. Yeah. So I just, on behalf of everyone who's here, on behalf of the Nonprofit Alliance, really want to thank Nonprofit HR and you, Lisa and Brian, for sharing what you've learned and a lot of your expertise today. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us today and is out there doing the work that you're doing in the field, and really appreciate everybody being here with us today. So thank you. Thank you both. Would either of you have a last line or something you want, parting thoughts that you'd like to send with everybody?
I certainly have one. Nonprofit HR has really taken this work seriously. So this is the 3rd time we've done this survey, and we're taking a step forward to help organizations who want to advance their journey. And we're hosting a critical racial immersion retreat here in the Washington, D.C. area in October. And that's for organizations and individuals who really want to advance their own awareness and knowledge and expertise in this space, but who also want to understand how that advancing their knowledge will help their organization. And so go online to our website, nonprofithr.com, click on the events page, and you can get more information about that racial immersion retreat. Brian will be one of the speakers, and so you can hear more from him. We also have a ton of free resources on our website that can be helpful to organizations as they think through their own journeys. Thank you so much, Abby. We appreciate the opportunity, and Nonprofit HR really remains committed to providing information in this space where organizations can benchmark where they are and make progress to a new place.
Great, thank you.